My name's Mike. Just your average, run-of-the-mill guy pushing 30, trying to make a buck in this godforsaken economy. For the past few years, that's meant bouncing between whatever dead-end jobs. I could find that wooden drug test too thoroughly. Landed a gig a few months back at the old Crestwood paper mill just outside of town. It's not glamorous work, hauling paper rolls the size of small cars and keeping the old machines from grinding themselves into scrap metal, but the pay's decent enough, especially for the night shift. And hey, they weren't exactly lining up to offer me a corner office downtown. The night shift. 12 hours of fluorescent hum, the rhythmic groan of machinery, and the distinct smell of processed wood pulp that seems to cling to your clothes, no matter how many times you wash them. Most folks dread it, the way it flips your life upside down and leaves you feeling like a vampire in a world built for the sun. But for me, I've always been a bit of a night owl. There's a certain quiet to the world when everyone else is asleep, a strange sort of peace that you don't find during the daytime chaos. Plus, the shift differential helps pad the paycheck, which is always a bonus when rent's due. The mill itself is a relic. Built back in the early 1900s, it looks like something straight out of an old black and white photograph. Brick walls stained dark with years of grime, massive windows that rattle in the wind, and a network of pipes and belts that snake through the cavernous interior like some kind of industrial leviathan. You can almost feel the history in the air, the echoes of generations of mill workers who've walked these same concrete floors. Most of the equipment is just as old, too, held together more by habit and sheer willpower than any modern engineering. It's the kind of place where you half expect a ghost to clock in for the midnight shift. Speaking of the midnight shift, that's my territory. 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., 4 days a week. Gives me the rest of the day to sleep, run errands, maybe catch a few hours of daylight if I'm lucky, the crew I work with. Well, that's where things start to get a little different. There's Earl, for starters. Guy's been at the mill since before I was born, probably. He's a walking encyclopedia of mill lore, knows every clank, and grown the machines make like they're old friends. He's a big, burly dude with a handlebar mustache that could rival a walrus's, always wearing the same faded denim overalls and a grease-stained baseball cap. Earl mostly keeps to himself, tinkering with the machinery in Sector 7. He doesn't talk much, but when he does, it's usually some cryptic warning about not messing with certain levers or avoiding specific areas of the mill after dark. I mostly chalk it up to old-timer superstition, but there's a certain seriousness in his eyes when he talks that makes you pause. Then there's Patty. She runs the packaging line, a whirlwind of energy despite the late hours. Patty's probably in her late 50s, with bright pink hair that always looks perfectly coiffed and a collection of cat-themed sweaters that's truly impressive. She's the kind of person who knows everyone's business, and isn't afraid to share her opinion on it. She's loud, she's opinionated, but she's also got a good heart underneath all that bluster. Patty's the one who usually brings in donuts on Friday mornings and makes sure everyone takes a break. She's like the den mother of the night shift, in her own unique, slightly chaotic way. And then there's Jedidiah. Jedidiah started around the same time I did, maybe a week or two before. He's a skinny guy, tall and lanky, with perpetually wide eyes that always seem to be darting around the room like he's expecting something to jump out at him. Jedidiah mostly works over in the storage warehouse, organizing inventory. He's quiet, almost unnervingly so. He rarely makes eye contact, and when you do manage to catch his gaze, it's like looking into a deep, empty well. He's got this habit of humming to himself, a low, tuneless drone that can get under your skin after a while. He never talks about his life outside of work, and nobody really knows where he comes from. He just sort of showed up one day. Our supervisor is a guy named Calvin, young, fresh out of college, probably sees this job as a stepping stone to something bigger and better. He tries to act all authoritative, barking orders and walking around with a clipboard like he's some kind of hotshot manager. But honestly, he's mostly clueless. He spends most of the night in his little office, microwaving leftovers and scrolling through his phone. As long as the quotas are met, he doesn't really seem to care what we're doing. Which, most nights, is fine by me. Less supervision means less hassle. But it's not just the personalities that are a little off. It's the things they say, the things they do. The way they sometimes look at each other and at me. I remember my first week. I was still trying to figure out the layout of the mill. I got turned around trying to find a break room and ended up wandering into Sector 4, an older part of the facility that's mostly used for long-term storage these days. It was darker than the rest of the mill, the air thick with dust and the smell of damp cardboard. I was about to turn back when I saw Earl standing near one of the towering stacks of paper rolls, just staring at it. "Hey Earl," I said, "you know where the break room is." He didn't respond at first, just kept staring at the paper rolls. Then, slowly, he turned his head towards me. His eyes looked different in the dim light, almost like they were reflecting something. "They don't like to be disturbed," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Ooh," I asked, confused. "He paper roll, sir." Just turned back to the stacks. I shrugged it off, figuring he was just having one of his odd moments, and eventually found the break room on my own. But that feeling of unease, the way he said, "they," it stuck with me. Another night I was on my rounds, checking the machinery in Sector 6. It's a noisy place, full of clanking gears and hissing steam. I was tightening a bolt on one of the old rollers when I heard Patty's voice over the intercom. "Jedidiah, could you bring a pallet of the heavy duty stock to line 3? "Jedidiah." There was no response. Patty tried again, her voice a little louder this time. Still nothing. A few minutes later, I saw Jedidiah walking past Sector 6, heading in the opposite direction of the packaging line. He was humming his usual tuneless melody, his eyes fixed straight ahead. "Hey Jedidiah," I called out, "Patty needs you over at line 3. He stopped, but didn't turn to face me. For a moment, he just stood there, perfectly still, his humming ceasing. Then, he slowly turned his head, his wide eyes focusing on me. There was something in his gaze that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't hostility, exactly. More like a deep, unsettling sadness. "They don't like it when we move things," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Who doesn't?" I asked, feeling a knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. He just stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned and continued walking in the wrong direction, his humming starting up again, a low, mournful sound that faded into the din of the machinery. I radioed Patty and told her I'd seen Jedidiah heading the other way. She just sighed and said she'd handle it. But the look on Jedidiah's face, the strange things he said, it was starting to get to me. It wasn't just Earl and Jedidiah either. Sometimes I'd catch Patty staring at the security cameras with this strange, almost knowing look on her face. Other times I'd hear Calvin talking to himself in his office, his voice rising and falling in a low, urgent tone, even though I knew he was the only one in there. And then there are the shifts when things just happen. Machines that malfunction for no apparent reason, lights flickering and going out in the older sections of the mill, strange noises echoing through the empty hallways when everyone is accounted for. Once I swore I saw a shadow move in the corner of my eye, a tall, thin figure that vanished as soon as I turned to look directly at it. I try to tell myself it's just the late hours, the monotony of the work, the way your mind starts playing tricks on you when you're tired and the world outside is dark and silent. But there's a feeling in the air here at Crestwood, a subtle shift in the atmosphere when the sun goes down, that I can't quite shake. It's like the mill itself is holding its breath, waiting for something. One of the things that really gets to me is the silence. Most nights, after Calvin retreats to his office and the initial rush of unloading the delivery trucks is over, the mill settles into this eerie quiet. The only sounds are the hum of the fluorescent lights, the distant rumble of the machinery, and the occasional creak of the old building settling. In that silence, every little noise seems amplified. A dropped wrench echoes like a gunshot. A sudden gust of wind rattling the windows sounds like someone trying to get in. And sometimes I hear other things. Faint sounds that I can't quite place. A soft scratching noise coming from behind the walls. A low, rhythmic thumping from somewhere deep within the mill's bowels. A whisper that seems to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Too faint to understand, but just loud enough to make you question your sanity. I've tried talking to the others about it, about the strange things I've seen and heard, but they just shrug it off. Earl just gives me a knowing look and mutters something about the old mill having its secrets. Patty laughs and says it's just the wind playing tricks. Jedidiah, if he's even around, just stares blankly as if he hasn't heard me. Calvin, of course, just tells me to focus on my work, so I've mostly kept it to myself. Figured I was just letting my imagination run wild. Until last night. Last night was different. The air felt heavier than usual, the silence in the mill more oppressive. Even Patty seemed a little quieter than normal, her usual cheerful banter replaced by a more subdued demeanour. Jedidiah was nowhere to be seen, which wasn't entirely unusual, but there was a sense of unease hanging in the air that made everyone a little jumpy. Around 3 in the morning, I was making my rounds in Sector 3, checking the pressure gauges on the steam pipes. It's an older section, dimly lit and always a little creepy. The pipes hiss and groan, and the shadows seem to dance in the periphery. As I was walking past one of the larger machines, I heard a noise. It was a soft, shuffling sound, like something was dragging across the concrete floor. It wasn't the usual sounds of the mill. This was different. I stopped and listened, my heart starting to pound in my chest. The sound came again, closer this time. It seemed to be coming from behind a stack of finished paper rolls. I hesitated for a moment. Maybe it was just a rat. We've had problems with rodents in the past. But this didn't sound like a rat. It was too heavy, too deliberate. I slowly moved towards the stack of paper, trying to be as quiet as possible. The shuffling sound continued, growing louder as I got closer. I peered around the edge of the stack, my breath catching in my throat at what I saw. It was Jedidiah. He was on the floor, his back to me, crawling slowly towards the wall. His movements were jerky and unnatural, like a puppet with tangled strings. And he was making that shuffling sound because his hands weren't on the floor. They were different. Longer, thinner, with what looked like sharp claws instead of fingernails. He reached the wall and pressed his face against the cold brick, his body twitching. Then he started to make a low, guttural sound like a growl. I just stood there, frozen in place, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. This wasn't Jedidiah. Not the Jedidiah I'd seen every night for the past few months. This was something else. Then he slowly turned his head, his body still pressed against the wall. His eyes, they were wide and wild, but they weren't looking at me. They seemed to be focused on something behind me, something I couldn't see. And then he smiled. It wasn't a human smile. It was wider, with too many teeth, sharp and pointed. And in that moment, I knew. The people I work with here, they aren't just different, they're something else entirely. And I have a very, very bad feeling about what that something is. My first instinct was to run. To bolt out of Sector 3 and never look back. But my feet felt like they were glued to the concrete floor. I couldn't tear my gaze away from Jedidiah. The way his body was contorted against the wall, the unnatural angle of his neck as he looked at something unseen behind me, that horrifying, inhuman smile, it was all burned into my retinas. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the smile vanished. His expression went blank, his body slumped slightly against the wall, and he let out a soft sigh that sounded almost normal. He blinked slowly, his wide eyes now focused on me, but the unsettling intensity was gone, replaced by his usual vacant stare. "Mike," he mumbled, his voice sounding groggy, like he'd just woken up. "Is everything all right?" My mind was racing had I imagined it. Was I hallucinating from exhaustion? But I knew what I had seen. I couldn't unsee it. The claws, the unnatural movements, that smile, it was real. "Yeah, just checking the gauges," I stammered, trying to sound casual. "Everything seems fine." I took a step back, putting some distance between us. Jedidiah just nodded slowly, then pushed himself off the wall. He looked disoriented, like he didn't quite know where he was. "I should get back to the warehouse," he said, his voice still a little slurred. He turned and walked past me, his movements now seemingly normal, that low, tuneless humming starting up again. I watched him go, my heart still pounding in my chest. What the hell had just happened? Was Jedidiah some kind of monster? A shapeshifter? The thought felt ridiculous, like something out of a bad horror movie. But I had seen it with my own eyes. I spent the rest of my rounds in Sector 3 on edge, every shadow seeming to hold a hidden threat, every creak of the pipes making me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see Jedidiah's monstrous form lurking in the darkness. But he didn't reappear. When my shift was almost over, I saw Jedidiah over by the loading docks, talking to Earl. They were standing in the dim light near one of the closed bay doors, their heads close together, whispering. As I walked past, they both fell silent, turning to look at me with those same unsettlingly blank expressions. Earl's usual gruff demeanor seemed amplified, his eyes narrowed in a way I hadn't seen before. Jedidiah's were just empty, devoid of any recognizable emotion. "Everything all right, Mike?" Earl asked, his voice low and even. "Yeah, just heading to the break room for a coffee before clocking out," I replied, trying to sound nonchalant. They just nodded slowly, then turned back to each other, resuming their hushed conversation. I hurried past, a cold dread settling in my stomach. Whatever was going on here wasn't normal, and I was starting to feel like I was the only one who could see it. The next night, I kept my distance from Jedidiah. I made sure to stay in the well-lit areas of the mill and focused on my work, trying to block out the strange things I had seen. But it wasn't easy. Every time I saw Jedidiah shuffling through the storage warehouse or moving pallets with the forklift, I couldn't help but look at his hands, searching for any sign of those claws. They always looked normal, just long and pale, but the image of them was seared into my memory. Patty was acting strange too. She was even more talkative than usual, constantly popping up wherever I was working, asking me questions about my weekend plans, my family, anything to keep me talking. It felt forced, like she was trying too hard to act normal, and her eyes. I kept catching her looking at me with this odd mixture of concern and something else I couldn't quite decipher. Pity, maybe, or was it fear? Even Calvin seemed different. He was spending less time in his office and more time walking around the mill floor, his eyes darting nervously, like he was expecting something to happen. He kept clearing his throat and muttering under his breath. "Everything on schedule, Mike?" he'd ask, his voice tight. "No issues." I just told him everything was fine, that the machines were running smoothly, the quotas were being met. He didn't seem convinced, but he didn't press it. It was during my break that night that things took another turn. I was in the break room, nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee and trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. Patty came in and sat down across from me, her pink hair looking a little less perfect than usual. "Mike," she said, her voice surprisingly serious, "can I talk to you about something?" I nodded, a sense of foreboding washing over me. It's about working here," she began, her eyes flicking nervously towards the door. Have you noticed anything unusual?" Finally, someone else was seeing it. I leaned forward, eager to share what I had experienced. "You mean like Jedidiah?" I asked, keeping my voice low. "The other night, in Sector 3, Patty's eyes widened. "What about Jedidiah?" I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. I saw something not right. "His hands," she nodded slowly, her expression grim. "Yeah, I've seen it too." Relief washed over me. I wasn't crazy. "And Earl," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you see him talking to Jedidiah last night, by the loading docks?" I nodded. "They got quiet when I walked by. They seemed secretive." Patty leaned closer, her voice dropping even lower. "They're always together, always whispering. And they look at us different." "What do you think it is?" I asked, my heart pounding. "What's going on here?" Patty sighed, running a hand through her pink hair. "I don't know, Mike. I've been working here for 15 years, and things have been changing. Slowly, at first. But lately," she trailed off, shaking her head. "What kind of changes?" I pressed. "Just little things. The way some of the older workers started acting distant, quiet. Some of them just disappeared. They said they quit, moved away. But I don't know." Her voice was laced with doubt. "And Jedidiah?" I asked. "How long has he been here?" "A few months," she replied. "Just like you. He just showed up one day. Needed the work, Calvin hired him on the spot. Didn't ask too many questions, I guess." "Did you ever notice anything off about him before?" Patty hesitated. "He's always been quiet, kept to himself. But lately, yeah, there's something unsettling about him. And Earl, he's been acting stranger than usual. More secretive, more protective of Jedidiah." Just then, Calvin walked into the break room, his eyes darting between Patty and me. He cleared his throat loudly. "Everything all right in here?" he asked, his voice a little too cheerful. "Got to keep that coffee flowing, right?" Patty and I exchanged a look. We both knew he had heard at least part of our conversation. "Just talking about the new machine in Sector 5. Patty said quickly, forcing a smile. "Having some teething problems." Calvin nodded slowly, but his eyes lingered on us for a moment longer before he went over to the coffee machine. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. After Calvin left, Patty looked at me, her expression worried. "We need to be careful, Mike. I don't think we're supposed to be talking about this." "But what do we do?" I asked, feeling a growing sense of panic. "I saw something, Patty. Something really messed up, Jedidiah. He wasn't human." Patty nodded slowly. "I believe you. I've seen things too. Things I can't explain." "Like what?" I pressed. She hesitated again, looking around the break room as if the walls had ears. "Sometimes, late at night, when the mill is really quiet, I hear noises. Not the usual machine sounds. Something else, like scraping. And sometimes I see shadows moving in places where nobody should be." "I've seen shadows too," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "And the smell," Patty added, her brow furrowed. "Have you noticed the smell? Sometimes, in certain parts of the mill, it's not just paper pulp and oil. It's something else. Something metallic, like blood." A wave of nausea washed over me. I had noticed that smell, especially in Sector 4. I had just tried to ignore it, to tell myself it was just my imagination. "We need to figure out what's going on here, Mike," Patty said, her voice filled with a newfound determination. "Before it's too late." "Too late for what?" I asked, the fear in my voice undeniable. Patty's eyes met mine, and in their depths I saw a reflection of my own terror. "I don't know," she whispered, "but I have a bad feeling about this. A really bad feeling. The rest of the shift crawled by. Patty and I tried to act normal, but the unspoken fear hung heavy between us. We kept looking at Earl and Jedidia, their quiet whispers and blank stares now taking on a sinister new meaning. Even Calvin seemed more on edge, constantly checking on us, his usual clueless demeanor replaced by a palpable anxiety. As the sun began to rise, casting a pale light through the mill's grimy windows, I felt a sense of relief that the night was finally over. I clocked out, my hand shaking slightly as I signed my time card. As I was leaving, I saw Earl and Jedidia standing by the main entrance, their backs to me. Earl had his arm around Jedidia's shoulder, and they were both looking out at the rising sun with those same unnervingly blank expressions. I didn't say goodbye. I just hurried out to my car. The image of Jedidia's inhuman smile and Patty's worried face burned into my mind. I knew one thing for sure. My nights at the Crestwood paper mill were never going to be the same. And I had a feeling that whatever was happening here was far more dangerous than I could ever imagine. I just hoped that Patty and I could figure it out before whatever darkness had taken root in this old mill decided to claim us too. The thought of those claws, it sent a shiver down my spine. I needed to sleep, but I knew that the image of Jedidia's smile would be waiting for me in my nightmares. And I couldn't shake the feeling that last night was just the beginning. Sleep didn't come easy that day. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Jedidia's face pressed against the brick wall, that unnatural smile stretching across his features. I kept replaying the scene in my head, trying to find some logical explanation, but there wasn't one. The way he moved, the claws, it defied anything I knew to be real. When my next shift rolled around, I was a nervous wreck. I seriously considered calling in sick, but the thought of being alone with my thoughts all night was even less appealing than facing whatever was going on at the mill. Plus, Patty was counting on me. We needed to figure this out. I arrived at Crestwood a little early, the setting sun casting long, eerie shadows across the parking lot. Patty was already there, waiting for me by the time clock. She looked just as tired and anxious as I felt. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked, her voice low. I shook my head. "You?" She sighed. "Maybe an hour. I kept seeing things in the dark." We clocked in together, a silent understanding passing between us. Tonight, we were in this together. The first few hours of the shift were uneventful, if you could call the usual unsettling atmosphere uneventful. Jedidia was there, moving silently through the storage warehouse, his humming a constant, low drone that seemed to vibrate through the very floor. Earl was in Sector 7, as always, tinkering with the ancient machinery, his movements slow and deliberate. Calvin stayed mostly in his office, the only sign of his presence the faint smell of microwave popcorn that wafted through the air. Patty and I worked our usual stations, but we kept a close eye on each other and on Jedidia and Earl. Every so often, our eyes would meet across the noisy mill floor, a silent question hanging in the air had the other one seen anything. Around 2 in the morning, Patty radioed me. "Mike, can you come over to the packaging line for a second? I need your help with something." I made my way over to line 3, where Patty was standing looking intently at a stack of finished boxes. "Take a look at this," she said, pointing to one of the boxes near the bottom of the stack. I knelt down and examined it. It looked like any other box of paper products, sealed and labelled. "What am I looking for?" I asked. Patty leaned closer. "Smell it." I hesitated for a moment, then cautiously brought the box closer to my nose. The usual scent of processed paper was there, but underneath it, faint yet unmistakable, was that metallic smell Patty had mentioned, the smell of blood. My stomach clenched. "I smell it," I whispered. "What does it mean?" Patty shook her head, her expression troubled. "I don't know. But I've been noticing it more and more on these boxes, especially the ones that get packaged late at night." We looked at each other, the unspoken implication hanging heavy in the air. Were they packaging something other than paper products? Something that bled? Just then, we heard Earl's voice boom across the mill floor. "Calvin, you might want to take a look at this." His voice sounded strained, almost panicked. Patty and I exchanged another worried glance and hurried over to Sector 7. We found Earl standing by one of the oldest and largest paper rolling machines. It had been offline for years, considered too dangerous to operate. Calvin was there too, looking flustered. "What is it, Earl?" Calvin asked, his voice tight. Earl pointed to the base of the machine. "There's something stuck in the gears." Calvin frowned. "Stuck? What do you mean?" Earl didn't answer, just reached down and pulled something out of the machinery. It was a piece of fabric torn and stained a dark, reddish-brown color. Patty and I gasped. It looked like part of a work uniform. "Where did you find this?" Patty asked, her voice trembling. "Wedged deep in the gears." Earl replied, his face grim. "Looks like it's been there for a while." Calvin picked up the fabric, his eyes widening as he examined it. This looks like... Wasn't there a maintenance worker who went missing a few years back? Earl nodded slowly. Yeah. Name was Frank. They said he probably just walked off the job. A chill ran down my spine. Walked off the job. Or was he fed to the machine? Just then, Jedidiah appeared, drawn by the commotion. He stood silently behind us, his wide eyes fixed on the piece of fabric in Calvin's hand. There was something in his gaze, a flicker of recognition, maybe even sadness. Suddenly, the lights in Sector 7 flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. A collective gasp went up. What the hell? Calvin exclaimed, fumbling for his flashlight. In the sudden darkness, I heard a low growl, coming from somewhere behind us. It wasn't human. Panic seized me. I fumbled for Patty's hand, our fingers locking together. Stay close, I whispered. Calvin's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating Jedidiah. He was standing perfectly still, his eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. And his hands, I could see them clearly now, even in the poor light. The fingers were elongated, tipped with sharp, black claws. It wasn't my imagination, it was real. The growling came again, louder this time and closer. Whatever it was moving towards us in the dark. Everybody stay calm. Calvin shouted, his voice cracking with fear. Let's just back away slowly. We started to move back, our eyes fixed on Jedidiah. He hadn't moved, his glowing eyes watching us intently. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on. Jedidiah's eyes were normal again, his hands looking like ordinary human hands. He blinked slowly, his usual vacant expression back in place. The growling had stopped. The darkness held its breath. Calvin shone his flashlight around the sector, but there was nothing else there. Just the old, silent machinery. What was that? Calvin stammered, his face pale. Nobody answered. We were all too stunned, too terrified to speak. Earl was the first to break the silence. Maybe it was just the old building settling, he said, his voice unconvincingly calm. You know how it gets. But we all knew that wasn't the truth. We had all heard the growling. I had seen Jedidiah's claws. Something was happening here, something terrible. The rest of the night was a blur of fear and paranoia. We tried to act normal, but the tension was unbearable. Every shadow seemed to hold a lurking monster. Every sudden noise made us jump. Patty and I stuck together, whispering nervously whenever Calvin wasn't around. What do we do? I asked her, my eyes filled with desperation. We can't just pretend like we didn't see what we saw. Patty shook her head. I don't know, Mike, but I think we need to get out of here. As soon as possible. But what about everyone else? I asked, looking over at Earl and even Calvin, who seemed completely oblivious to the true danger we were in. Patty's expression was grim. I don't think they're like us, Mike. I think they're part of it. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. Earl's secretive behaviour, Jedidiah's strange transformations, even Calvin's cluelessness now seemed to fit into a terrifying pattern. Were Patty and I the only normal ones left on this night shift? As the sun began to rise, I made a decision. I couldn't stay here any longer. Whatever was going on at the Crestwood paper mill was far beyond my ability to understand or handle. I had to get out, and I had to convince Patty to come with me. When the shift ended, I found Patty by the time clock, her face etched with worry. I'm quitting, I said to her, my voice firm. I'm not coming back here. Her eyes widened. Really? Just like that? I can't stay here, Patty. Not after what I saw last night. You saw it too. We need to get out. She looked around the mill floor, her gaze lingering on Earl and Jedidiah, who were standing near the main entrance, their backs to us. I don't know, Mike, she said hesitantly. I need this job. Not as much as you need your life, I replied, my voice urgent. Please, come with me. We can figure something else out. She bit her lip, her eyes filled with conflict. The fear was there, I could see it, but so was the desperation of needing the job. Just think about it, I said, placing a hand on her arm. Whatever is happening here, it's not safe. We need to leave before it's too late. I didn't wait for her answer. I clocked out, my heart pounding in my chest, and walked out into the morning light. I didn't look back. I couldn't. As I drove away from the Crestwood paper mill for what I hoped was the last time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was leaving Patty behind in terrible danger. I knew I should have tried harder to convince her to come with me. But the fear of what I had seen, the chilling realization that I was working alongside monsters, had overwhelmed everything else. I don't know what the night shift at Crestwood really is. I don't know what Jedidiah and Earl are. I don't even want to know. All I know is that I got out. And I pray that Patty does too, because if she doesn't, I have a feeling that the next piece of fabric found in those old machines might be bright pink, and I'll never forgive myself for leaving her behind. The drive away from Crestwood felt surreal. The morning sun was bright, the world outside the mill gates looked normal, peaceful even. It was hard to reconcile the horrors I had witnessed with the ordinary Tuesday morning unfolding around me. I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see Patty's car following me, but it never materialized. Days turned into weeks. I stayed away from Crestwood, ignoring the few calls I got from Calvin asking why I hadn't shown up for my shifts. I didn't know what to tell him, even if I wanted to. How could I explain what I had seen? Who would believe me? They'd probably think I was crazy. I managed to find another job eventually, this time at a daytime warehouse across town. The pay wasn't as good, and the work was just as monotonous, but at least I didn't have to spend my nights in fear. Wondering what kind of monsters I was working alongside, I tried to put the whole thing behind me, to chalk it up to stress and an overactive imagination fueled by too many late nights. But the image of Jedidiah's claws, the metallic smell in the air, Patty's worried face, they were all still there, lurking in the back of my mind. I often wondered about Patty. Did she quit? Did she see what I saw that night in Sector 7? Was she still working there, trapped in that nightmare? I tried looking her up online, but her social media was sparse, and I couldn't find a phone number for her. Part of me was afraid of what I might find. One rainy Saturday, a few months after I left Crestwood, I found myself restless and unable to shake the memories. I decided to drive out to the old mill. I told myself it was just curiosity, a need to see if things looked any different in the daylight. The mill looked even more dilapidated in the rain, the brick walls stained darker, the windows grimy and broken in places. The parking lot was mostly empty, just a few cars scattered here and there. As I sat in my car across the street, watching the silent, foreboding building, I saw someone leaving. It was Earl. He was wearing the same faded overalls and grease, stained cap, his walrus mustache twitching slightly as he walked towards an old pickup truck. He looked older somehow, more stooped. As he passed under a flickering streetlight, I noticed something else. His hands. They looked different. Longer, the fingers more slender than I remembered, and the way he moved there was a slight, almost imperceptible, twitch in his gait. My blood ran cold. Was it possible? Had Earl changed too? Or had I just never noticed before? He got into his truck and drove away, leaving me staring at the mill, a renewed wave of fear washing over me. Whatever was happening inside those walls wasn't contained to just one or two people. It seemed to be spreading. A few weeks later, I stumbled across a local news article online. It was a brief piece, tucked away in the crime section. The headline read, "Body found at old paper mill." My heart leaped into my throat. I clicked on the article, my hands trembling. The article stated that the body of a woman had been found inside the Crestwood paper mill by maintenance workers. The body was badly decomposed and identification was difficult, but authorities believed it to be that of a missing night shift worker named Patricia Miller. Patricia Miller. Patty. The article went on to say that the cause of death was undetermined, but there were unusual lacerations on the body. The police were investigating. I stared at the article, the words blurring through the tears welling up in my eyes. They found Patty, but it was too late. The bad feeling she had was right, and I had left her there. A wave of guilt and regret washed over me, so powerful it almost knocked me out of my chair. I should have stayed. I should have tried harder to convince her to leave with me. Maybe if I had, maybe she would still be alive. But then I remembered Jedidiah's smile, Earl's glowing eyes in the dark, the growling in Sector 7. What could I have done? I was just one person. They were something else. The article mentioned that the mill was temporarily shut down while the investigation was ongoing, but I knew the truth. The police wouldn't find anything. Whatever had happened to Patty, whatever was happening at Crestwood, wasn't something they could understand. A few months later, I saw another article. The investigation into the death at the Crestwood paper mill had gone cold. The mill was scheduled to reopen under new management. New management. I shuddered at the thought of the new night shift workers who would unknowingly walk into that building, into that darkness. Would they notice the subtle differences in their colleagues? Would they hear the whispers in the silence? Would they see the claws in the dim light? I knew I couldn't keep quiet. I had to tell someone. I tried going to the police, but they just listened politely, and then politely dismissed my story as the ramblings of a disgruntled former employee. They had the news article about Patty's death, the unusual lacerations, but they seemed focused on finding a human perpetrator. They couldn't comprehend what I was trying to tell them. So, I'm writing this down. Maybe someone out there will believe me. Maybe someone else has worked the night shift at Crestwood and seen the same things I did. Maybe this will serve as a warning to anyone considering taking a job there. The Crestwood paper mill isn't just an old, run-down factory. It's something else. The people who work the night shift there, they're not all human. There's something different, something dangerous. And Patty paid the price for working alongside them. I still have nightmares about that night. I see Jedediah's smile, Earl's glowing eyes, hear the growling in the dark, and I see Patty's face, her worried expression the last time I saw her. I don't work night shifts anymore. I don't go out after dark. The world feels safer in the daylight. But even now, years later, whenever I see an old brick building with grimy windows or smell the faint scent of paper pulp, a shiver runs down my spine. I know they're still out there, in the darkness, in the silence of the night shift, waiting. And I can't help but wonder how many more people will walk through those doors and never come out the same, or not come out at all. The night shift, it changes things. It changes people. And sometimes, the people you work with are different in ways you can't even begin to imagine. Trust me, I know. I worked the night shift at Crestwood, and I barely made it out alive. Patty wasn't so lucky, and every time the sun sets, I remember her, and I remember what I saw. And I know that somewhere, in the darkness, the night shift is still going on, and the people there are still different. Very, very different. And if you ever find yourself working the night shift, you need to be careful. You never know who or what you might be working with.